Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Python for Bankers series, where we learn how to use the numeric computing power provided by Python's fantastic ecosystem for banking related case studies, kind of a learning path for folks from the finance background. As you can see, I'm shooting this from my bedroom late at night. You can see the blurry city lights in the background. So it's going to be another 15-minute video. It won't be dragged on for too long to keep it short and compact. Now, we've mentioned SQL in the last video, but haven't really gone into what it means. So today's video is created to do just that. We will write some SQL, or SQL as some people like to call it. I use them interchangeably. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and it is the standard way of communicating with your database. This video will cover some of the common SQL constructs, things like the select statement, the where clause, and the likes. So you need an SQL editor, or even maybe with Visual Studio Code and extension, whichever you prefer. If you're not sure what to use, do a Google search on SQL Editor. Put that into the search bar, pick one that has a UI that you like. I'm using Table Plus, but it shouldn't matter. I just want to say that I'm not affiliated with them and not paid to recommend them. It's just what I use. So following up from the last video, now that we've created our SQLite database, you can see there is a loan.db file sitting right here. So this is the file, loan.db, or whatever you name it. So I use loan.db. So if you follow along that video, if you don't know what I'm saying, go back to the first video and make sure you've gone through the part where I talk about how to go from a CSV to a SQLite. Okay, now you can open this in whatever software, whatever application that you have. I'm gonna open that up in Table Plus. So let me right click on that, open with, and do Table Plus, and wait for it to come up. Okay, once I've launched Table Plus, I get to see all my connections in grouped together in its own logical groupings. Yours may look very different from mine. I'm not gonna worry about that. I'm just gonna close that out and go back to this is loan.db, so I can see that I made a connection to my local SQLite database, and this is a list of all the tables. Now, in the first part of the video, we didn't get too fancy. We created one table and we named the table records. So this is gonna be the only table that I see. Now, again, your interface may look different depending on what SQL editor you're gonna be using. So I'm gonna click on records right now and just take a very quick look at how it looks like. So I have the ID, I have the year, so these are records of loan applications, right? So I have the issued, final, employment length, home ownership, income category, annual income, and so on and so forth. There are 800 over 1,000 rows of data. So here it says 887,000 rows of data, 379. And you notice that this is a lot more performant than expecting to work with this as in a CSV. A CSV is really just a flat file separate with the values separated by commas. So when you put them into SQLite, you get a lot more performance right out of the box. You get to write SQL query language and query against the database. You get to work with a more performant method of storing data and querying data. So that's really nice. Okay, so now we have all of this. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna click on the SQL editor. So I'm gonna close this one up. Click on the SQL editor, and here I start off with a blank SQL, sort of an SQL editor where I can write my code and execute my code and run my code. So let me resize this a little bit better so you can see all of that working. Let me resize this. Want to make sure that it's all fits within my window. So change that like that. I'm gonna close this up now. Okay, so this is where I write my SQL, and then I would hit either Command Enter, or I would just click on this button to run it. Now again, the interface may differ greatly depending on what you end up using. I believe Table Plus has a free version, so if you want to use that, go ahead, pause the video and get that downloaded, and then we can follow along writing the SQL line by line. Okay, so we've seen some of these examples already actually. The first thing we did in the last video was we write a select statement. So let's go ahead and let's try to get the same result from what we did in the last video, and now let's write it right in here within the SQL editor from Table Plus. So let's start off by convention. I like to put all these SQL statements in capital case. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter. You can write them in normal case if you want to. Just lowercase select. That also works. But I like to make them uppercase, so it's clearer. It's more apparent to me what is SQL and what is not. Okay. Then I put this asterisk to say all. So select all columns. Select all columns from what? So I'm going to say from records. And now this is not SQL. This is actually my table name. This is my table name. So they don't have to be capital case. So I'm just gonna put lowercase. And then now if I run this, it's gonna show all 800,000 rows of data. So I don't actually want that to happen. I actually only want to see the first 5 results. So I'm gonna say limit 5. If you want to set limit 6, that's up to you. That's just basically says find the first 6. Collect all the columns. Select all the columns from our table. Our table is named records, and limit the return result to only 6 rows of data. Okay. What I'm gonna do as well, I can actually just command shift enter and put them in different rows like that. So it's easier to look at. It's clearer to look at. It's easier to look at. It's up to you. You can put everything in one line. If you use SQL Editor, there is also a good chance that it includes some sort of like a beautify. So this is Command I or Control I, right? So what I can do is I can hit Control I or Command I, and that would just format it once you've done writing your code. So you can hit Control I or Command I, and that just beautify your code, put them in this very nice indentation and new lines. That's up to you if you want to do that. Okay, completely it's a personal preference. But once you've done, you don't see any results because you haven't run your current command. So what you need to do now is to hit Control Enter or Command Enter. So let's do that. Run it. Now we see the first 6 rows, and notice that it says here 6 rows, telling you that it has indeed performed the select statement from the records table and show you only the first 6 rows. You can export that to CSV, to whatever that it is that you want to work with. Later on, when you use Python, you likely don't have to export to CSV to do that in Python. You can use something like an ORM. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Or you will use something like Pandas, the Pandas library. We all love them, don't we? Right? So we have multiple ways to work with an SQL database, and we talk about them in the future when we start to use Python to interact with that directly. For now, let's learn a little bit of SQL because I think it's always good, especially if you're trying to pick up data science as a professional, as a career. Having a bit of SQL doesn't hurt. Okay, so we have our first 6 rows of data. We can scroll here and take a look at how it looks like. Now notice that things are not really ordered right now. I can let's pick one column. Let's pick the annual income column. You see there's 24,000, 30,000, 12,000, 49,000, 80,000, 36,000. So they're not really ordered in any meaningful way. Now how do we change that? Well, turns out we can go ahead and actually say select from. We can add something called the order by, right? I also briefly mentioned about that in my last video, but I can go ahead and say order by, and order by what, right? Order by what? So the column name here is called annual underscore income. So what I want to do is I want to say select this from records, select all the columns from records, but don't return them in this order. Return them in the order of annual income. So the way I do that is I just add the column name. And you notice that because I'm using a SQL editor, it gives me this autocomplete, so I can just hit tab, and it will just complete the sentence, complete the statement for me. So I can do annual, and it gives me that. I can just hit tab, completes that for me, and then what do? I hit Control I or Command I to format it a little bit, give it the right indentation and the right new lines. Notice that all of these are really just conventions. All of these are just nice to have. If you want to really be ugly about it and just put everything on one line, your code still runs, your SQL still works. So this will still work. Okay. So notice that I'm actually just doing all of that because it's more legible and people can see it, and everything is in its own line and it's prettier to look at. So once you've done that, I want you to just hit Control Enter or Command Enter if you're following along. And you will see now that if you scroll over to annual income, that now it's properly ordered. So from 0 all the way up to larger amounts, but I only returned the first 6 rows of the table. Okay. Now, what if you want to do the inverse of that? You want to order that, but in descending order. How do you do that? You wonder, right? So one thing you can do is you can just add a descending order, DESC, like that. You can format that nicely. In this case, we've done it the right way already in the first place. And then you can run the code again, but now with a descending order. If you take a look at annual income, you see that the highest amount comes up, and then slowly goes down. And here it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Let's change that to maybe, let's find something, loan amount. Let's change that to loan amount. Okay, run that. And hover over to annual income loan amount here. right? So we see all the greatest amount first to the lowest amount, and because we only return the first 6 rows, that's what we're gonna see. That's what we're gonna get. Okay, and things can get a little bit more tricky from here, and we can introduce a little bit more constructs on this. But this is a very common operation. So when if you this is the first time you're working with SQL or data science in general or data analytics in general, this is something that you want to get very familiar with. This is a very common routine. Select something from something, order by, and then limit. Usually you want to, the limit is not always necessary. Sometimes you do not want to limit, but in most cases, when I'm doing some sort of exploratory analysis, when I'm doing some sort of probing, drilling, I usually always include limit, because you don't want the whole thing returned to you, because the whole thing is what, 880 rows of data, and I don't want the whole thing to be returned to me. I just want to take a look at the first 6 rows to make sure that my statements here are correct. Okay, so if you need to pause the video a little bit and practice this, I recommend you do that. So maybe go ahead and try to query from something else, from something, order by some other columns instead of lone amount. Try and put your own spin on it and try and change things a little bit to get yourself very familiar. If you don't have this database, all you need to do is to create that, and you can follow the first part of the video of the series. Okay, my first video in the series. Now let's actually make things a little bit more different. Let's spice things up a little bit. I can actually, instead of select all the columns, I can specify the columns that I want. So I can actually go ahead and say something like, let's take the first, let's say the second, third, fourth. I'm going to say year, put a comma. I can say issue, date, put a comma, and I can say final, date. And again, there's 3. And I can actually just run the command, and now I only return the first 3 columns instead of all of the columns. So now there are 3 columns instead of, now the order by doesn't make sense. Now I would have to change something to maybe to year. Okay, so select year, issue, a date, final date from the records table. This is how I name my table. Order by what? Order by the year column. Okay, and run that. So this is how it looks like. There are a few other things you can do with this select statement. So I can actually, let's go ahead and actually select all of them again, just so we can see. Or you can actually just click on this, and it will just open that up. In my interface, it opens it up in a new tab, so I can actually have both tabs open and just switch between them. You may be using a different SQL editor, and you may have to find out how to do that depending on what application you end up using. Okay, so once we have the select and we learn about selecting specific columns, we're gonna go ahead and actually select what else you can do with this column thing is that you can actually go ahead and let's find something like home ownership. So I'm gonna say select home ownership, put a comma, and I wanna, let's say, find let's say annual income, maybe this one, annual income. Yeah, I think we can do a select from. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna say select from. Now I'm gonna introduce another thing. I'm gonna say group by. So I'm gonna say group by, and what am I gonna group by? I'm gonna group by home ownership, and then this can go in the new tab like that. And I'm gonna actually do something like take the sum of annual income like that. So what am I gonna do is I'm gonna say select home ownership, take the home ownership column, and then create this new column. This new column, I want it to be computed based on what? Based on the sum. How? By grouping the home ownership. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna look at all the annual income, and it's gonna group by home ownership. So basically it's gonna find the group home ownership. It's gonna say the mortgage, the rent, the own, and for each of this group, it's gonna compute by using the sum function, which is the total of annual income. And then I'm gonna say group by home ownership, and I can, now the order by doesn't make sense, so let's go ahead and say order by, and now we can order by the sum and I can put the annual income again, right? If this is getting too complicated, then just stop right there and just say select home ownership sum annual income from records group by home ownership. We just run that, and you see these results. So what it does is that it says, okay, take each of the group or each of the category in home ownership. So I have mortgage, none, other, own, and rent. And for each one of them, right? Because I return, well, how many columns do I return? 1 and 2. So I have home ownership and sum annual income. So this is the first column. This is the one here that is computed. How does it compute? It computes by group. Group by what? Home ownership, and using the sum function. So I know this is a little handful and this is maybe a spike in difficulty, but if you need to, the way you can get good at this is to practice a lot. So I want you to, if you need the time to practice, just pause the video and do another kind of group by, and once you get familiar with it, then you move on from the video. Okay, now what we're really doing is that once you group by, because this is not really ordered in any way, so maybe what you can do now is you pause the video and see if you can add an order by statement here. So let's say I want to add an order by here. So how would you complete this? Okay, so pause the video a little bit and try and see if you know how to complete this. I want to order by this column, so that I want to such that the smallest value is up there and the largest value is at the bottom. Okay, so how would you do that? Take a second. Okay, if you guess that, oh, well, I just need to order by this column, then you're right. So all you need to do is just copy the name of that column, and you can rename the column later, but we haven't got there yet. So just order by that. If you want to put descent, you can put descent, but we don't have to do that now. We just run the command, and now you see this is how it looks like, right? So the annual income, the total income, you can change this sum to something else, average or something. We'll do that later, but for now, let's stick with sum. Okay. And this is something that you likely need to practice a lot before you get used to it. Okay, but this is how, very generally speaking, what you get here. And you need to be careful here as well with the limit statement, because if I put a limit 4, for example, and I run this, whoops, 4. Now, let's see, what do I get here? I get only any none other owned. So you may be thinking that, hey, these are the only 4 categories, but then you'll be wrong, because here there are actually more categories than this 4 that is presented in here. And because you put a limit 4, you're probably going to be misreading the data, or you're going to misinterpret the data. So make sure you're careful about how you're using the limit when you do something like group by. Okay, so if you don't put a group by here, if you don't put a limit here, we just remove all of that, run enter. And now you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the 6 of them. Okay. So now let's move on and actually introduce one more level of one more layer of complexity. Okay. So once we have the order by, and again, I challenged you earlier, how do you descend this? How do you make the highest value? How do you get mortgage on the first row and any on the bottom row? How do you invert the order of this ordering? So how would you do that? You would do what? You would do descend, right? Here. So you write that, run that code. Now you get mortgage all the way up top, the first one, and then in descending order, you get the remaining categories of home ownership in descending order. Okay. Another one that is very common is the clause, the where clause. Okay, another clause that is very common is the where clause. So this is how it's done. When you say select home ownership and annual income from records, what you can do is you can add a condition here, and the condition goes something like this. You say where, and then you put your condition. So here you can say where the name is equal to what, when the account number looks like this. This is your own condition. So let's find a condition that we can work with. Let's take a look at the original data, the table. Income category is interesting. We can actually work with income category. So there's a low capital L, medium capital M. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we can say where income. Again, it tries to autocomplete from me. All I need to do is hit on tab, and then I can put something like equal. And remember, there is a capital M for medium, so I'm gonna do that. Let's make sure that's the case. That's the case. So once you have that, the rest remain the same. Do I need to order by? No, because it's group by, and this is not gonna be huge, like 800,000 rows of data. So I don't need to actually limit that. So I'm gonna run the code now, and now I see this executes select home ownership and an extra computed column. How do you compute that? Using the sum on the for each group of home ownership. Okay, so select this from records, the name of a table, where income category equals to medium, group by home ownership, that makes sense, order by this column in descending order. Okay, and you can put you can actually add extra, more complicated where clause. You can do a couple of other things. For example, let's go back there. What do we have? Medium, low. I assume that we're gonna see some high at some point, but there's not a lot of people who are in the high income category, and yeah, there is one. Okay, but anyway, we're gonna actually go in there and actually say in and what we're gonna do is take all of this, copy this, put this in a bracket like that, whoops, and put medium, and we're gonna put a high. So just making sure that there is actually in fact a high. So this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna say select home ownership, sum, annual income. So that we're gonna return two columns. If you want to return more columns, you can actually do that as well. You can maybe take the term. So when you try and take a loan, you usually specify for what is the term of your loan, right? Whether it's you plan for repayment within 36 months or 60 months or whatever that is, you can add more of that. You can add term, which is here, and you can run that. Now in this case here, what it's gonna do is it's gonna say from records the name of the table where income category is in, medium, or high. So I'm not gonna worry about that. Just gonna stick to this so you can interpret your numbers a little bit better. And so we see a mortgage, and then this is a sum. Okay, so this is not terribly complicated, but it takes a lot more practice to get very comfortable with writing SQL query. If this is the first time you're doing this, it may take a little bit of getting used to, right? Especially when you have things like sum, annual income, and stuff. It's probably easier if you don't have to do the group by clause, but this is so powerful and it is so common for a lot of data analysis routines and the kind of questions that you may have when it comes to exploratory data analysis. So I want you to get very familiar with this, and once you have a grasp of it, try and complete the quizzes, and once you're ready, I'll see you in the third part of the third installment of this series.